Mark Weston was a senior project manager at a reputable tech firm in Austin, Texas. The city, known for its vibrant music scene and entrepreneurial spirit, was where Mark found solace after leaving behind a quiet, small-town life. His career was marked by precision and dedication. He had helped lead multiple projects that put his company on the map for innovation. But the fast-paced environment left little room for deep friendships. Mark's social circle mainly consisted of colleagues and his few close friends from college. Mark was never the type to draw attention, but people respected him for his reliability. Tall, with a sturdy build from years of early morning runs and a neat appearance, he was the definition of an unsung hero at his firm. His path took a new turn when he met Emily at a mutual friend's holiday party. Emily was a marketing executive at a well-known firm downtown. Her striking intelligence and infectious laughter captivated Mark immediately. She was the kind of person who brought warmth to any room she entered, and soon she brought warmth into Mark's structured life. Their relationship blossomed quickly. Within a year, they were married in a modest ceremony at a local vineyard. Life seemed perfect for Mark. His career was stable, and Emily's love made him feel invincible. Friends would often joke about how Mark was the luckiest man alive, having found a partner who shared his passions for travel, culinary adventures, and quiet evenings by the lake. Emily, however, carried a mysterious side. Raised in an influential New York family, she had stories that hinted at more complex layers. Mark loved listening to tales about her childhood summers in the Hamptons, although he noticed she rarely spoke about her college years in detail. He chalked it up to private memories and respected her silence. Emily was fiercely independent, insisting on maintaining her own finances. Mark agreed, believing it kept their marriage harmonious. The early years were golden. They spent weekends driving through the Texas Hill Country, trying wines and laughing over roadside barbecue. Mark felt himself evolving, shedding his image as the corporate workhorse and becoming a partner in life's adventures. But just as he reached the peak of contentment, subtle changes began to creep in. Emily started traveling more frequently for work, her schedule becoming erratic. Late-night texts and calls from colleagues became the norm. Mark, though puzzled, reminded himself that they both had demanding jobs. He rationalized her distance with the pressure she faced in marketing, where the stakes were always high. The turning point came with their 5th anniversary looming. Mark, ever the planner, decided to organize a surprise party. He wanted to rekindle the magic of their first years together. The party planning became an anchor for him during Emily's continued absences. He worked with Lena, his close friend and a talented event coordinator, to pull off an unforgettable evening at one of the city's newest rooftop venues. Excited, Mark hinted at a big surprise, and Emily's reaction was enthusiastic, though distracted. The days leading up to the anniversary were tense. Emily's phone buzzed incessantly, and she was unusually guarded. Mark's curiosity was piqued, but he dismissed his unease as pre-celebration nerves. Yet, a persistent, knowing feeling crept into his thoughts. He noticed the way she'd step outside for private calls, her smile faltering when she thought he wasn't watching. Then came the night before the party. Emily came home late, her eyes rimmed with fatigue and her demeanor distant. Mark, who was going over last-minute details, looked up and saw her face, an expression he hadn't seen before. Fear and something else he couldn't quite place. "Is everything okay?" he asked, putting down his notes. Emily blinked as if snapped out of a trance. "Yes, Mark. Just a tough day. Let's get some sleep." But as they turned off the lights, Mark lay awake, staring at the ceiling, feeling the first true pangs of uncertainty. The stage was set for the party, but beneath the surface, questions were starting to brew. The feeling of safety and predictability that had once surrounded his marriage was slipping, and Mark Weston was about to be thrust into an emotional storm he never anticipated. The night of the anniversary party arrived, and Austin's skyline sparkled with city lights. Mark dressed carefully, selecting a tailored navy suit Emily had once said made him look like a movie star. It was an evening that was meant to mark not only their love, but also a moment of reconnection. He arrived early to the rooftop venue to ensure everything was perfect. The string lights were softly glowing, jazz music played in the background, and tables were set with fresh white lilies, Emily's favorite flower. Guests began to arrive, including close friends from the tech world and Emily's colleagues from her marketing firm. Laughter bubbled through the air as old friends reminisced and new connections were made. Mark greeted everyone warmly, his eyes frequently scanning the entrance for Emily's arrival. Lena, who had been a rock during the planning process, came up to him with a reassuring smile. "She'll be here soon, Mark. Don't worry. Everything is perfect," Lena said, squeezing his shoulder. Minutes ticked by, and just when Mark felt his nervousness start to show, Emily walked in. The entire room seemed to pause as she entered, wearing a sleek emerald dress that caught the glow of the city lights. Her hair was swept up, and she looked every bit as radiant as the day they married. But there was something in her eyes that was different. Guarded, almost as if she had built an invisible barrier between herself and the world around her. Mark's heart thudded in his chest as he walked up to greet her. "You look incredible," he whispered, leaning in for a kiss. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. The evening unfolded smoothly at first. Emily was charming, laughing with friends, and mingling with coworkers who had come to celebrate. Mark watched her from across the room, a sense of pride mixed with a touch of something he couldn't name. But as the night wore on, he noticed her slipping into conversations with a man he didn't recognize. He was tall, well-dressed, and had a confident demeanor that made him stand out even in the lively crowd. "Mark, who's that talking to Emily?" Lena asked, noticing the shift in his expression. "I'm not sure," Mark replied, forcing a smile. "Probably a colleague I haven't met." But as he watched them, the ease with which they spoke and the way the man leaned in close set off alarms in Mark's mind. A series of small gestures, the subtle touch of Emily's arm, the way she tilted her head and laughed felt too familiar. His stomach tightened as he realized he had seen that look before, but never directed at him. Deciding he needed clarity, Mark approached them, his heart pounding. The stranger noticed him first and straightened, his face shifting into a polite mask. Emily turned, a flicker of something unreadable crossing her face. "Mark, this is Connor Pierce, a former client," Emily said smoothly, her voice steady but her eyes betraying a hint of discomfort. "Nice to meet you, Mark," Connor said, extending his hand. Mark shook it, noting the firm grip and the glint of confidence in Connor's eyes. "The pleasure's mine," Mark responded, his tone measured. "I hope you're enjoying the party." "Absolutely. You've thrown quite an event," Connor said, a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. With a nod to Emily, he added, "I'll let you two enjoy the rest of your evening." As Connor walked away, the tension between Mark and Emily was palpable. Before he could ask anything, Emily said, "Let's not do this here, Mark. It's our anniversary." "What do you mean, do this?" Mark's voice was barely above a whisper, but the edge in it was sharp. Emily sighed, the warmth in her expression replaced by resignation. "Please, not now." A loud cheer erupted as Lena raised a toast, saving them from the silent standoff. Mark plastered on a smile as glasses clinked and laughter filled the air, but inside, his world was beginning to crack. The rest of the night passed in a blur. Emily danced with friends, her movements graceful and controlled, while Mark felt like a spectator, unable to connect with the joy around him. When the last guests left and the venue began to empty, Mark and Emily stood alone under the string lights, the city stretching out behind them like an indifferent sea of lights. "Are you going to tell me what that was?" Mark asked, his voice low, careful. Emily looked away, the facade slipping from her face. "Mark, I didn't want it to come to this, but we can't ignore it anymore." "Come to what, Emily? What haven't we been ignoring?" He stepped closer, searching her eyes for a trace of the woman he thought he knew. She swallowed, eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Connor and I. It's complicated. We've been talking." Mark felt the floor tilt beneath him, a cold wave rushing through his veins. "Talking? Is that all?" The words came out more desperate than he intended. Emily didn't answer. The silence between them was as loud as the city noise below, and in that moment, Mark knew the life he had built was no longer the one he was living. The days following the anniversary party were suffocating. Mark moved through his routine like a ghost, his mind consumed by what Emily had said and what she had left unsaid. The quiet tension in their home was like a storm waiting to break. Emily continued to come and go, her schedule erratic, and Mark felt like an intruder in his own life. At work, Mark's focus was shattered. His colleagues noticed his distracted state, and Lena, who knew him better than most, cornered him during a lunch break. "Mark, you've been off ever since the party. What's going on?" Lena's voice was laced with concern, her eyes searching his face for answers. Mark glanced around, ensuring no one was close enough to overhear. "It's Emily," he said, rubbing his temples. "I think there's someone else." Lena's expression darkened with understanding. She reached out and squeezed his arm. "I'm so sorry, Mark. Have you talked to her?" "Only enough to know she's hiding something. She admitted they've been talking, but I can't shake the feeling that it's more." Lena hesitated, then spoke softly. "You deserve to know the truth. Maybe it's time to get some answers, even if it hurts." Mark nodded, feeling a mix of gratitude and the deep ache of betrayal. That evening, Mark returned home to an empty house. Emily had sent a vague text saying she was working late, which was starting to feel like a routine excuse. He sat on the edge of their bed, staring at the framed photos on the dresser. Their wedding day, a trip to Big Sur, a candid shot of them laughing at a backyard barbecue. Each image now felt like a cruel joke, a reminder of a reality that had slipped away. Determined to find clarity, Mark accessed their shared digital calendar and noted down the days she'd claimed to be working late or out of town for business trips. A pattern emerged, linking specific dates to certain travel locations. His heart sank as he realized many of these coincided with cities where Connor Pierce's company had hosted marketing events. Mark's pulse quickened. He wasn't tech-savvy enough to hack into accounts or track phones, but he remembered that Emily sometimes left her work laptop at home. That night, he found it tucked into her home office, still logged into her emails. His hands shook as he clicked through, hesitating at first, battling the guilt of invading her privacy, but the need for the truth won out. It didn't take long. Buried in a folder marked Archives were a series of emails between Emily and Connor. They were professional at first, full of marketing jargon and client updates. But as the emails progressed, they became more personal, more intimate. One from 3 months ago made Mark's stomach churn. Asterisk, "Connor, last night was incredible. I don't know how we keep doing this without anyone suspecting. Sometimes I think about what it would mean to take that leap." Asterisk. Mark's vision blurred, and he felt the heat rise to his face. The implications were undeniable. He scrolled further, each email another dagger to the chest. Memories of missed calls, unexplained absences, and the way Emily had been avoiding his touch all made sense now. Before he could process what he found, the front door clicked open. Emily's voice echoed through the hall, calling his name. Mark slammed the laptop shut and stood, hands trembling as he braced himself against the desk. "Mark, are you in here?" Emily's voice grew closer, carrying a note of unease. He stepped out into the hallway, meeting her gaze. She stopped mid-step, the keys in her hand clinking softly as her expression turned cautious. "We need to talk," Mark said, his voice steady but strained. Emily's eyes darted between him and the shut door of her office. She seemed to realize in an instant what had happened. Her face paled, and the confident mask she'd worn for weeks fell away. "Mark, please, let me explain," she whispered. Mark clenched his jaw, the pain in his chest almost unbearable. "Explain? How do you explain this, Emily? How do you justify lying to us, for God knows how long?" Tears welled in her eyes, and for a moment, Mark saw the woman he had fallen in love with. Vulnerable, scared, human. But it wasn't enough to soften the jagged edge of his anger. "Connor was a mistake," Emily said, her voice breaking. "It started during those work trips, and I didn't know how to stop it. I didn't want to hurt you." "Didn't want to hurt me?" Mark repeated, incredulous. "You didn't just hurt me, Emily. You broke everything we built." Silence filled the room, heavy and suffocating. Emily reached out, but Mark stepped back. The distance between them felt like a chasm. "Mark, I'm so sorry," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I don't expect forgiveness, but I need you to know that I love you. I never stopped." But Mark knew the truth. Love shouldn't feel like this. It shouldn't leave a person questioning their worth, replaying memories to see where it all went wrong. "I need some time," Mark said finally, his voice hollow. Without waiting for her response, he grabbed his coat and walked out, the cold night air biting at his skin as he stepped into the dark, uncertain streets of Austin. Mark spent the next few nights in a small, budget motel on the outskirts of the city, its neon sign flickering in and out like a heartbeat. The room was cold and impersonal, but it was a refuge from the suffocating betrayal that had seeped into every corner of his home. His phone buzzed incessantly with missed calls and texts from Emily, each notification a reminder of the chaos waiting for him. Asterisk Mark, please come home. We need to talk. I'm so sorry. Let me explain everything properly. I don't want to lose you, asterisk. He stared at her messages, the words twisting the knife deeper. He didn't reply. Instead, he turned off his phone, letting silence envelop him. The world outside continued to move at its relentless pace, while Mark felt suspended in time, stuck between the man he was before the betrayal and the uncertain figure he was becoming. The next day, Mark met with Lena at a quiet cafe downtown. He needed someone to talk to, someone who knew him before his life had become an unrecognizable mess. "I was afraid of this," Lena said softly after he told her everything, eyes wide with concern. "I saw the way she looked at him at the party. I should have said something." Mark shook his head, forcing a thin smile. "It's not on you, Lena. I was the one who missed it, who ignored the signs." Lena reached across the table, squeezing his hand. "What are you going to do now?" "I don't know," he admitted. "Part of me wants to try to fix it, but another part of me wonders if it's worth it. How do you come back from something like this?" Lena sighed, her expression turning serious. "Sometimes you don't, Mark, and that's okay. It's okay to choose yourself this time." As the days passed, Mark returned to work and tried to piece his life back together. But the routine that once gave him comfort now felt hollow. The office buzzed with the usual energy of deadlines and meetings, but Mark moved through it like a ghost. Colleagues gave him sideways glances, sensing his detachment but saying nothing. At night, Mark lay awake in the narrow motel bed, haunted by memories of better times. The way Emily's laughter would light up their kitchen during Saturday morning breakfasts, the feel of her hand slipping into his as they strolled by the river. But those memories now felt tainted, the past rewritten by her betrayal. One evening, unable to bear the isolation any longer, Mark called his younger brother Chris. They hadn't been close since Chris moved to Los Angeles for work, but family was family. "Mark, it's good to hear from you," Chris said, his voice warm with surprise. "What's up?" "I need someone to talk to," Mark confessed, the words coming out in a rush. "It's Emily. She's been unfaithful." The silence on the other end stretched long enough for Mark to regret calling. But then Chris's voice, firm and understanding, cut through. "Come to Mark. Take a break. Get away from it all. I have a guest room and I could use the company." The idea seemed reckless, but as Mark hung up, it felt like the first hopeful note in weeks. He needed distance from Emily, from the suffocating city, and from the broken version of himself. Before leaving, he sent a short message to Emily. Asterisk, I'm going away for a while. Don't contact me. I need space. Asterisk, he didn't wait for a reply before packing a suitcase and heading for the airport. The flight to Los Angeles was a blur. The hum of the engines and the scattered conversations around him blended into a background noise that matched the turmoil in his mind. When he landed, the city welcomed him with its warmth and sprawling lights. Chris picked him up at the airport, offering a grin that was both familiar and comforting. "Welcome to the West Coast, brother," Chris said, pulling him into a hug. It felt like a lifeline. The days that followed were a mixture of long conversations on Chris' balcony, overlooking the Hollywood Hills, and silent moments of introspection. Chris was patient, giving Mark the space to talk when he needed to, and simply being there when words failed. "I think she loved me once," Mark said one night, staring into the city's expanse. But somewhere along the way, it changed, and I didn't even see it coming. Maybe she did, Chris said carefully. But love shouldn't mean carrying the weight of someone else's betrayal. You have a chance to start over, Mark. Don't let this define you. Mark nodded, the weight on his chest loosening, if only a little. He knew going back to Austin meant confronting the reality he had left behind, but for the first time, he felt like he might be ready. The distance had given him perspective, and he realized that no matter what Emily said or how many times she apologized, he had to choose himself. A week later, Mark booked a flight back to Austin. The man who boarded the plane this time felt different, stronger, resolved. He didn't know what awaited him back in Texas, but he knew one thing. He wasn't going to be defined by betrayal. When Mark returned to Austin, the familiarity of the city hit him like a wave. The winding roads, the neon glow of 6th Street, and the steady hum of life moving on despite personal turmoil. It was all the same, yet Mark felt fundamentally changed. He hadn't told Emily when he was coming back, and as he pulled into the driveway of their house, he sat in the car for a moment, letting the engine's soft rumble ground him. The house stood there, unassuming and ordinary, yet it now seemed like a stranger to him. He took a deep breath and walked up to the front door, keys in hand. The door swung open before he could use them, and there stood Emily. She looked thinner, her eyes rimmed with exhaustion and worry. "Mark," she whispered, as though saying his name might shatter the fragile silence between them. "You're back." "I am," he said, his voice steady. He pushed past her and set his suitcase down in the hallway. The air was thick with tension, each second stretching into eternity. "I didn't know if you'd come back," Emily admitted, shifting her weight nervously. Mark met her eyes, searching for a sign of the woman he loved for years. "I needed time to think. But we can't go on like this, Emily. We need to face it." Emily's eyes welled up, and she nodded. "I know." They sat in the living room, the same space where they shared countless movie nights and late-night conversations. Now it felt like a courtroom, the walls ready to bear witness to whatever came next. "Why him?" Mark asked, breaking the silence. The question wasn't just about Connor. It was about every choice that led them to this moment. Emily looked down at her hands, fingers fidgeting nervously. "I didn't plan it, Mark. At first, it was just work, talking about projects, late nights comparing strategies. But then, there became more. I didn't mean for it to happen. I felt lost, disconnected, and he was there." Mark listened, the ache in his chest growing sharper. Was I that absent? His voice was raw, laced with a mixture of pain and disbelief. "No, Mark. It wasn't you. It was me," she said, tears slipping down her cheeks. "I kept looking for something outside of us, thinking it would fill whatever was missing inside me. But it didn't." The room fell silent again. Mark leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "You know, I looked through your emails. I found out how long this has been going on. It wasn't just talking, Emily." Emily's face crumpled, and she wiped her eyes. "I know. I betrayed you, and I betrayed us. I don't expect forgiveness, but I am sorry. More than you'll ever know." Mark's heart wavered at her words, but anger and grief still held their grip. "I can't just pretend this didn't happen. You shattered the trust we built. I'm not sure I can put it back together." Emily nodded slowly, as if she had been preparing for this. "I understand. I want to try, but only if you do. If you can't, I'll accept it. You deserve peace." The silence between them wasn't as suffocating as before. It felt more like a crossroad, a place where decisions had to be made. Mark sat back, letting his gaze wander around the room, the photo frames, the bookshelf, the half-burned candle on the coffee table. They were fragments of a life that felt simultaneously familiar and distant. "I need time, Emily," he finally said. "Time to figure out if I want to fight for this or let it go." Emily swallowed hard, her eyes closing as if to steel herself. "Take all the time you need. I'll be here if you decide you want to try." They sat there for a while, not as husband and wife, but as two people caught in the wreckage of something they once cherished. The future was uncertain, But for now, Mark knew he needed to reclaim who he was, apart from the pain, apart from the betrayal. Over the next few weeks, they lived as strangers under the same roof. Mark threw himself into work, finding solace in tasks and projects that required his full attention. Emily kept her distance, giving him the space he needed. They spoke in polite exchanges, but the deeper conversations that once defined their relationship were absent. One evening, Mark received a text from Chris. Thinking of you. Hope you're finding your way. Brother he stared at the message for a moment before typing back, I am. Slowly, but I am. The days turned into weeks, and Mark found himself changing. He started running again, each mile clearing a path through the confusion. He spent weekends with Lena and their group of friends, rediscovering the things that made him feel alive. He even signed up for a pottery class, something he'd wanted to try for years but had never made time for. Emily noticed the change. She watched him from afar, a mix of hope and regret in her eyes. One evening, as Mark sat on the porch with a glass of iced tea, Emily approached hesitantly. "Mark, can I sit with you?" she asked. He looked up, surprised, then nodded. They sat in silence, the warm summer breeze carrying the scent of jasmine from their garden. "I see you changing," Emily said quietly. "I'm glad. You deserve happiness, Mark." Mark looked at her, the shadows between them no longer as dark. "I'm finding it, but I don't know if it can include us." Emily nodded, a small, bittersweet smile playing on her lips. "Whatever you decide, I'll respect it." In that moment, Mark realized that choosing himself didn't mean he had to hate her forever. It meant accepting the pain, the lessons, and the uncertain path ahead. And for the first time in months, he felt a spark of hope that maybe, just maybe, he would be okay. As the weeks unfolded, Mark embraced a routine that felt both familiar and new. He continued to navigate the delicate space between coexistence and separation with Emily. Their conversations remained cordial, but neither ventured beyond safe topics. The house was filled with echoes of who they used to be, but slowly, those echoes started to fade as Mark found pieces of himself in unexpected places. One Saturday, Mark was invited by Lena and some friends to join a weekend hike in the nearby Barton Creek Greenbelt. The morning was bright and clear with the promise of a warm afternoon. Mark hadn't been on a hike in years, but the idea of fresh air and good company sounded like the change he needed. He met Lena and the others at the trailhead, exchanging smiles and greetings that felt genuine. "Glad you came," Lena said as they started down the path, her eyes warm with encouragement. "Me too," Mark replied, feeling the sun on his face. The canopy of trees overhead dappled the trail with light and shadow, a mirror to his shifting emotions. As they walked, the group bantered and laughed, and Mark found himself smiling, really smiling, for the first time in what felt like an eternity. The hike was challenging but invigorating, each step carrying him farther from the weight of the past few months. When they reached a clearing with a view of the city skyline in the distance, Mark stood silently, taking it in. For once, he didn't think about Emily or the unraveling of their life. He thought about himself and the possibilities that lay ahead. After the hike, Lena pulled him aside as the group packed up. "You seem lighter today," she noted, her voice gentle but probing. Mark nodded, a soft chuckle escaping him. "I guess I am. It's been a while since I felt like me." Lena smiled, a knowing look in her eyes. "Keep going, Mark. You're doing great." Back at home, Emily noticed the change. She watched him reclaim parts of his life with a mixture of admiration and sadness. One evening, she came into the living room where Mark was reading, a book in one hand and a cup of tea in the other. "Mark," she said, her voice hesitant. He looked up, meeting her gaze for the first time in days. "I've been thinking, maybe it's time for me to leave." Mark set the book down, a feeling of finality settling over him. He nodded slowly. "I think you're right." There was no anger in his tone, no accusation, just acceptance. Emily blinked, a tear slipping down her cheek as she nodded back. "I'm sorry for everything," she whispered. "I know," Mark said, his voice quiet but steady. "And I hope you find what you're looking for." The next week, Emily packed her belongings. The house felt emptier with each item she took, but Mark was surprised to find a sense of relief in the empty spaces. On her last day, they stood in the entryway, facing each other. There were no dramatic goodbyes, just a silent acknowledgement that their chapter had come to an end. When the door closed behind her, Mark let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. The silence that followed was heavy but not suffocating. He was alone, but it didn't feel lonely. It felt like the first true step toward healing. Over the next few months, Mark's life took on new dimensions. He pursued activities he'd long put off, like the pottery class he joined. His first few pieces were misshapen and imperfect, but he found joy in the process. The simple act of molding clay reminded him that life, too, could be shaped with time and care. Lena became a close confidant, and while there were moments of vulnerability, they maintained their friendship without crossing the boundaries they both respected. She encouraged him to try new things, and they began organizing monthly outings with friends, trivia nights, concerts, and even an impromptu trip to a food truck festival where Mark discovered a newfound love for Korean barbecue. One evening, as Mark was cleaning up his kitchen after hosting a small dinner party, Lena lingered behind, sipping a glass of wine. "You seem different, she said, setting the glass on the counter. Lighter, more present. Mark wiped his hands on a towel, leaning against the counter and looking at her with a grateful smile. "I feel different. For the first time in a long time, I'm not just surviving, I'm living." Lena's smile widened. "You deserve it, Mark." They stood there, the quiet of the house surrounding them like a gentle embrace. The past was still a part of him, but it no longer defined him. There were still moments when memories of Emily surfaced, but they were like distant echoes, reminders of what he had endured and overcome. Later that night, as Mark sat on the back porch looking at the stars, he realized that his journey had only just begun. The path forward was still uncertain, but it was his to choose. And for the first time, that uncertainty felt like freedom. Months turned into a year, and the rhythms of Mark's life continued to evolve. The pain that had once felt insurmountable now lay in the past, like the faint scar of an old wound, visible, but no longer raw. He had settled into a version of himself that felt whole and authentic, marked by resilience rather than brokenness. Mark's days were filled with new experiences. The pottery class, which had started as a way to distract himself, had become a true passion. He found joy in shaping clay into forms that were uniquely his own, imperfections and all. His shelves were lined with pieces that told a story of growth. A wobbly first attempt, a lopsided vase, and eventually a set of mugs that he gifted to friends. They joked that they were drinking from Mark Originals. At work, he became more involved in projects that aligned with his interests, mentoring younger colleagues and participating in think tanks that tackled innovative tech solutions. His boss even mentioned the possibility of a promotion, recognizing the renewed energy Mark brought to the team. This new chapter was not just about moving forward, it was about redefining his place in the world. Emily's departure had been a clean break. She had reached out once, months after leaving, sending a simple message that read, "Asterisk, I hope you're doing well, Mark. I wish you happiness, asterisk." He had stared at it for a moment, the familiar pain tugging at him, but he found it easier to let go. He replied with a brief, genuine response. "Asterisk, I am. I wish the same for you, asterisk." Lena remained a steady part of his life. Their friendship had deepened, marked by shared moments that ranged from adventurous hikes to quiet evenings discussing life over a bottle of wine. They had learned to be open with each other, their conversations candid and comforting. The unspoken question of whether their friendship could evolve into something more lingered between them, but neither felt the need to rush an answer. One evening, Mark decided to throw a celebration at his house, a nod to the person he had become over the past year. He invited friends from work, Lena, and some new acquaintances from the pottery studio. The house that had once been a symbol of loss now buzzed with laughter and warmth. Music played in the background, and the smell of grilled food and warm bread filled the air. Lena arrived late, juggling a tray of cupcakes she had made. She looked around the room, taking in the lively scene with a smile. When she found Mark, he was in the kitchen, talking animatedly with a colleague about a recent project. "There you are," she said, holding up the tray. "Cupcakes, to make sure everyone leaves with a sugar high." Mark laughed, a genuine sound that made his eyes crinkle at the corners. "You're the hero of the night," he said, taking the tray and setting it on the counter. The evening passed in a blur of conversations, shared stories, and moments that reminded Mark how far he had come. As the party wound down, guests filtered out, leaving just a few close friends. Lena lingered, leaning against the counter with a glass of wine in her hand, watching Mark clean up. "Remember last year?" she said, her tone light but her eyes serious. "I don't think either of us imagined you'd be here, hosting a party like this." Mark looked around, the remnants of the celebration scattered around the room, the empty glasses, the laughter that still seemed to echo in the air. "No, I didn't," he admitted, his voice softer. "But I'm glad I am." They stood in a comfortable silence, the kind that spoke volumes without needing words. Lena took a step closer, the space between them charged with a question that had lingered for months. "Mark," she began, searching his eyes, "do you ever think about what's next? For us?" He set down the dish towel and met her gaze, a slow smile forming. "I do, and I think we're ready to find out." A flicker of surprise and relief crossed her face, and she nodded. "Good, because so do I." They closed the distance, the shift from friendship to something more feeling natural, as if it had always been waiting beneath the surface. The kiss was gentle, filled with the promise of something new, yet grounded in the trust they had built. In that moment, Mark realized that healing was not a straight path. It was winding, full of detours, and sometimes took longer than expected. But as he stood there with Lena, in the house that had seen him at his lowest and now at his best, he knew that the journey was worth every step. The night deepened, and the city outside hummed with life. Mark and Lena sat together on the back porch, the stars above them bright and unwavering. The future was still uncertain, but now it was filled with possibilities that made Mark feel something he hadn't in a long time: hope. And that, he knew, was more than enough.